Welcome to the PowerShell Podcast, the podcast for PowerShell and the PowerShell community.
Far more powerful than all the others.
And now, here's your hosts, Jordan Hammond and Andrew Plough.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the PowerShell Podcast. I'm Ultra Superstar Jordan with the best looking co-host in the business, Andrew Plough.
Wow, thank you so much. Best looking guy. We got more audio listeners than video, but thank you.
Everyone knows this. Everyone knows who Andrew is. So at the end of Summit, we did catch a lot of interviews, but there was one interview that I think all parties decided that we were too exhausted by the end, so we decided to loop back around.
Yeah. Summit was amazing. Such a great event. Before we get to that, though, Jordan, last week, my birthday, it was amazing. Thanks for all the kind and warm wishes, everyone. It meant a lot to me and means a lot to me. But Jordan, it is your birthday episode, my friend. And you know what? We brought some of Microsoft's finest to celebrate with you, my man. Happy birthday.
Can't think of a better way to spend my 93rd.
But yeah, you were mentioning the Docathon on the last day of PowerShell Summit was run by these fine gentlemen right here. And what was the Docathon?
I guess that's for us.
Well, I guess before too far, we have with us Sean Wheeler, Mike Robbins, and Mikey Lombardi, the who's who of PowerShell documentation. Is that a fair assessment?
That's fair. So the Docathon was an attempt to get community involvement with community contributions to help improve a set of documentation. And we went through the process of how you contribute to docs and what our sort of our editorial style and standards are, and really focused on some cleanup work in the Windows PowerShell docs, which is an area that's been long neglected because there's no owner. It's not part of the portfolio that Mike or Mikey or I manage. So we help out there as much as we can, but it's not part of our day job. And so the goal there was to, clean up the content as much as possible. And I would say it was a real success. We had a lot of people in the room to hear the message initially, around 63 people, I think. Of that, we had 19 people submit PRs, and 62 PRs was the final count through the weekend. So on Monday, we started reviewing the PRs and getting them merged. And ultimately, we improved 204 documents. So huge success. Super happy. And it seemed like people were having fun and were excited about contributing in the future, and hopefully we'll get some more of that.
Awesome.
So this replaced Iron Scripter this year. Is this something where it's going to be like the new thing going forward? Or do you think they're going to find a way to get both Iron Scripter and Docathon in for future summits?
That's a good question. And I think that's more a question for James Petty, but I heard him say that he's put Iron Scripter on hold for a couple of years and may come back to it. It depends, I think, on Jeff Hicks, if he wants to continue to run it. He puts in a lot of effort into that event. So
for the Docathon, did you have to go through teaching people the basics of kind of GitHub and Git? Was that the first part, or how did people go about handling that?
We covered that briefly, and we had a session earlier in the day. Mike and I where we went through the whole process and talked about Git and GitHub and what the workflow is there. But I had put stuff out in the Slack channel for the summit for the Docathon with some sort of prerequisites. The things you need to have and the tools you need to install and things like that. And so it was kind of the assumption that people were at least familiar with Git and the GitHub process. But we were also there in the room with a few others to help people through that process.
Nice. I saw some people learning that. And that's one of my favorite things about docs, and whenever we tell people to contribute to docs and that kind of thing, is it's a really great first opportunity to familiarize yourself with pull requests, GitHub, Git, a lot of things that for me for a while were kind of confusing until you kind of go through and decode what all these different words mean that sound similar but mean different things. It's a good experience to go through. Now, if I could, I'm curious, you mentioned contributing. I saw that there might be a new article on contributing with code spaces. Can you expound?
Yeah, Mikey, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a while back, we'd started using Veil and a bunch of other tools locally to make authoring easier on ourselves. And then when we wanted to make authoring and editing easier for external contributors, realized that this list of things that you needed to know and have set up to contribute to docs with, all the bells and whistles just kept getting longer and longer and longer. And I don't know about you, but when I'm contributing to a project, if the get set up to contribute steps are more than like 3 steps long, my brain shuts off and I can't.
Yep.
And so I just wanted to smooth that out for other people. So started by defining a local dev container and then using that myself for a little while. And followed that up by seeing what it would take to define GitHub code spaces, which are built on dev containers. So to take a brief aside on how GitHub code spaces work, at GitHub's annual conference this year, they announced that they were going to take their code spaces and then make them free for, I think, up to 60 hours a month if you're using the lowest amount of resources. And so I was like, that's really nice because it's coming out of beta. I cannot imagine anybody contributing to docs for more than 60 hours a week. That seems like a lot. I don't contribute to docs for more for 60 hours a month. I contribute to docs only like twice that much in a month, and that's my job. So outside contributors doing that, I figured they wouldn't hit the limit, which made it interesting. So what is a code space? If you've ever been on GitHub and used the web editor experience, which you can do if you go to any repository on GitHub and hit the period key on your keyboard, it'll reopen that page in the web editor, which is a hosted web interface for VS Code. But there are some limitations with that, largely around what sort of software and extensions will run, because it's just running as a web service, right? So if the extensions or tools can't run as node packages, if they're not designed that way, then they won't work, which meant you couldn't use Veil. Veil is a command line app, so there was no way to do that. So that would require having some sort of machine behind it. What GitHub Codespaces does is takes the web editor a step further and actually spins up a container that GitHub runs that you can define to have any software and settings and whatever you want pre-installed on it. So now from your perspective, you go into GitHub and you open up the web editor and you say, actually, I want to be in a code space. There's a shortcut command for that. And then it spins up a container on the back end, does all the pre-build configuration stuff for you. And now your editing, contributing experience is the same as the one that I have on my workstation. But you don't have to know anything about all that stuff. Everything just lights up for you. So what that means in practice for our contributors is now when you're authoring your contribution, you automatically get hints about issues with your prose, that things that Sean and I and Mike will have to tell you in your review, except you see it while you're writing. Every time you hit save, it says, hey, you need to use contractions and you're not. Or you can't use terminology like this, or you're using the wrong syntax for links and lists and whatever. So it can do all those things. And it just provides a much easier, lower friction, because you don't need VS Code locally or any of those types of things. You could just hit a URL and then you're ready to contribute. So our goal was to lower that friction, and I think that accomplishes it.
Yeah, and that was one of the learnings from the Hackadoc session. A lot of time at the beginning was spent helping people set up the tools on their own laptops. And if we had the code spaces set up, then we could just tell them, connect to the code space. And you can do that connection to the code space in your local copy of VS Code, or as Mikey was saying, you could do it in the web interface of GitHub.
That is super cool. And so on the low end, if you're really new to this whole GitHub thing, I think Mikey highlighted something that blew my mind the first time I saw it, which was press period on a repository and it opens up a web editor, which is wild and super cool that we're in this day and age with these tools. But you took it a step further, and because there are some limitations with that, you connected it kind of sort of to something that runs in GitHub that gives you everything you need. So you can have the exact same experience, whether you're you or me or whoever.
Right. And you don't need to know about what we've configured in there. It just lights up for you. So you don't have to read documentation about how to use Veil or whatever. You just get that feedback automatically.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense, right? We apply these principles to a bunch of other things, right? Why don't we apply them to the way we contribute to documentation or contribute to projects in general? What do you call that experience? Like user experience, developer experience? What do you think of?
I tend to think of it as developer experience. Part of that is because that was the last job I had before I moved into Docs. And it put a worm in my brain that is just constantly screaming. How can we make this better? How can we make this smoother? I guess you could also call it maybe contributor experience, because it's not just around writing code. These types of improvements that we're investing in and we're seeing people invest in sort of across the industry now are around, I want to make a quick and helpful fix to a typo in documentation. Why do I need to figure out how to clone your repository, set up an editor, load your tools to fix a 2-word typo? You shouldn't have to. It should be easier than that.
Yep. And it's better if it is easier, because we can use that time and energy for other things, because there's a lot of hard things that we have to do every day. So let's maybe make it easier. And maybe we'll click on less phishing links too while we're at it. Who knows?
So it's funny. I've always a thought I've had with business in general for a long time, which is always, why do you make it difficult to take my money? This is just the next level of that principle is, why do you make it difficult to contribute, to help out? It's removing barriers is a fantastic endeavor.
I think it's kind of like that's what a manager does, is right. They try and remove barriers. That's what a good manager kind of does. But I think that in any opportunity, if someone who's responsible for a system can remove barriers to entry, it's just a universally good thing. So cool.
Yeah, I think about it a lot in terms of friction, right? When I want to do something, there's a certain amount of friction that I'm willing to fight and get through to do that thing. And once I hit too much of that friction, when it's too hard to walk up that slope, right, I just walk away. Okay, well, I'm not getting to the top today. Maybe somebody else will. And what I find is that people will often leave and not come back when they hit a friction point like that. We experienced that back when I was at Puppet. We experienced that with Docs today, with tons and tons of different situations. And I think it's particularly important to focus on these types of contributor things for open source projects. If it's closed source and it's just your team, you can mandate that your team follows practices, right? There's some level of peer accountability, team accountability that's in place that you can like say, no, you have to follow these steps. External people can just walk away at any time. Like, you're getting a gift from them when somebody contributes to an open source project, whether that's a docs contribution or an issue contribution, or if it's a code contribution, whatever. Those are gifts, and making it hard for people to give you gifts seems pretty silly on its face.
Agreed.
There's the other side. If you hit the point where they're that frustrated, they're also not going to leave a note on their way out. I tried. This was too difficult. They're just going to disappear, and you're not going to even get the feedback on there was an issue. So,
100%.
But if you want to get started with contributing using GitHub code spaces to PowerShell docs, there's a fantastic blog. It'll be in our show notes. Check it out. It goes through everything you need to know. Mike Robbins, how you doing, man? Long time no see.
Doing well. Yeah, it's great to be here again.
So there is, last time we had you on as a guest, you talked about the Azure Predictor in PowerShell, which, I'll be honest, it didn't wow me in the moment, but I got to see it in action a lot more at Summit. You were trying to get me ahead of the game on something spectacular. So I just want to say I apologize. I didn't give that the full weight, because I got to see what that predictor does, especially with the new updates with PS Readline. Man, that is something everyone should be looking into. Predictors are amazing.
Yeah, definitely. And we have a doc on that. I can provide a link for it. But Predictor is actually, you install it via a PowerShell module. It's the az.tools.predictor module. And it does require PowerShell 7 and also a specific version of PS Readline. So if you're still one of the people that are stuck on Windows PowerShell, you're using like the ISE instead of VS Code, then you're not going to be able to take advantage of this awesome functionality.
Yeah, and I guess a quick breakdown for those. It's almost like an AI version that's specific for those commandlets, for the Azure commandlets, because the Azure commandlet there's so many. So having something that's like you start typing in is like where you're most likely looking for something in this range, where it doesn't, especially where you don't have a history, just helping it fill out the command you're looking for it's a big time saver.
Definitely, because with the AZ PowerShell modules, there's over 6,000 commands. And if you install AZ Preview, which includes all the GA and Preview modules, we have over 150 modules.
Wow. I can't even count that high. So there, Mike, you mentioned that there is a blog that people can check out if they want to get set up, but this sounds kind of like a necessary thing if you're working in Azure every day. Like, I just imagine the ROI you're going to get from having this is pretty high. And in general, lately, we've been really encouraging people to take advantage, reduce friction in your console when you can. Right, install things like this. Make sure PS Readline is installed with the latest version. Take advantage of some of the awesome functionality there.
Yeah, but one thing with so I mentioned PowerShell 7 and a certain version of the PS Readline. One thing to keep in mind is you don't have to go out to all your servers and everything and update those to PowerShell 7, although that would be great too. But you can load just PowerShell 7 and these tools on your development workstation and take advantage when you're developing your scripts and functions and different things where you're going to be automating resources in Azure.
Yeah, so it's not like an entire system or environment install. It's a local install, because you're using it to help you build the script. The script is going to run when you send it over. It's going to be the full commandlet. So it really doesn't take much. It's just a couple of lines of code, I think. I'm going to, wish I had on top of my head, but you basically, the newest version of PS Readline, install the connector, and I think they even changed PS Readline by default to look for connectors, so you don't even have to point it and say, use this as a predictor, or it's the selection source.
I think there's enable AZ Predictor command also.
So one thing I'll say, if you want to see what all this is about without having to install anything, we actually have this enabled by default in Cloud Shell now. So you can hop in Cloud Shell and take a look at what AZ Predictor looks like.
Nice. Cloud Shell is Seems like it's improved quite a bit over the years. It sounds like more and more people are starting to use it. You ever play around with that, Mike?
Yeah, so if you and you can just go to shell.azure.com, and that'll put you directly in Cloud Shell. And of course, you can run the Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell from there. The other neat thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is you can actually run Cloud Shell from Windows Terminal. So you can have it as a tab in Windows Terminal, and it looks and feels like a local shell. But that way you don't have to install the AZ PowerShell module and worry about keeping it up to date, because we keep the version that's installed in Cloud Shell up to date automatically.
Nice. I imagine a lot of people who are Azure admins are probably rocking that, because you have access to all your modules and you're already connected to all your sessions, right, in Cloud Shell?
That's
Kinda
right.
makes-
So you're already authenticated. There's no reason to run like Connect AZ account unless you want to change the subscription or the tenant that you're logged into.
Right. Nice. Yeah, that definitely makes things a bit easier. And I was just checking out the Learn page for Azure PowerShell. There's some cool stuff on there. Looks like there's a training on automating Azure tasks from PowerShell. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, so if you want to get to the main docs, and there'll be a link in the show notes, but it's real easy. It's aka.ms/azps, and that'll get you to the primary page for the install docs, the configuration, the AZ Predictor, the all the documentation for the reference commands. And I'm the docs writer for all of those. So we have several versions. So there's like I said, so there's over 6,000 docs for the reference commands, and we maintain 3 versions. So we support the current major version, which is currently 9.7.1, and then also the previous major version, which I believe is 8.3.0. And when version 10 comes out, we'll drop support for version 8. So customers need to upgrade at least once a year to stay in the supported configuration.
Good to know. Now, we're mentioning some usability stuff, making Azure more usable, predictions, Cloud Shell. There's a really cool Learn Microsoft article I was checking out, the optimizing your shell experience. Any of you responsible for that one?
Yeah, that's actually a whole collection of articles I put together. It's part of the main PowerShell docs, because we had done a good job with reference documentation about commandlets and how to use commandlets, but there was really very little documentation about how to use the shell itself. What your experience is in the terminal and all of that. And PS readline is great, and we have documentation on the PS readline commandlets and APIs that it exposes, but there was no real user documentation for that. So this is some fairly recent documentation. We're looking to expand it even more, showing people how to use the shell and get the most out of it.
Yeah, reading through this, massively helpful stuff here. Stuff that I think if you go about PowerShell, maybe a more traditional method of just kind of running commands and going about things and discovering it. Oh, you see this random thing on the internet here and there. You're going to be missing out on a lot of the stuff that you cover here, and quick. I mean, things like running commands in the shell, running native commands, passing arguments. These are things that can occasionally get people hung up and can increase friction. And I highly recommend, if you're listening to this and you're not 1,000,000% comfortable with your workflow and how you have everything set up and how you're using PowerShell, check this out. There's a lot of great stuff in here, especially when it comes to PS readline key handlers. That's a very, very, to me, a sign of like, oh, you're really trying to customize your console experience if you're working with key handlers and going that route.
Yeah, and people don't realize what key handlers are turned on automatically. There's a lot of cool features that people just aren't using. I think the one that surprises people the most is the Alt-A that allows you to, you can pull up a command from your history and edit it quickly by changing parameter values. And Alt-A will toggle between all of the parameter values on the command line, selecting the value so you can just type over it and enter a new value there. That's a real time saver. I use it all the time. I'm forever committing things to Git and submitting PRs from the command line and such. And but the parameters that I use are slightly, the command's the same, but the parameter values are different. So I can just pull up my history, hit Alt-A, and make the change.
Yeah, one thing with the key handlers, so PowerShell and Azure PowerShell both are cross-platform, so they run on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. And the key handlers are not all that you'll see in Windows are not always defined in Linux or Mac OS. So I define some of those in my profile, so I get the same experience when I'm using different operating systems.
Yeah, one of the things we added to the key handlers article here was how to enable the Alt key on Mac OS for the two popular terminals, because Mac treats the Alt key differently than Windows and Linux systems do.
Where did you say that was?
It's in the using PS readline key handlers article, but
I see that.
There's a section there that covers Mac OS and turning on the Alt key.
Wow, so helpful. Imagine running into that just like randomly and not having any documentation. Very awesome to see these articles. I didn't actually see that you went to that level of detail helping people on different platforms, because it is a cross-platform language, so makes sense, but appreciate that there's that thought and care that went into it. So sweet. All the way down to configuring iTerm too.
Yeah. Yeah, Terminal is the one that's built into Mac OS, and iTerm 2 is probably the other most popular terminal that people use. And it's the one that the PowerShell dev team uses most. So they're willing to support it. But there's dozens of different terminals, so your mileage may vary.
And if you want, you mentioned looking at the key handlers that are already configured, and you talked about Alt-A, but if you wanted to check this, you can run git ps readline key handler. And I have a question about that Alt-A one, because I had a friend who was super into Linux, and for some reason in my head, I have Alt-A to select a parameter or something like that. Was this borrowed from a Linux thing? Do you know, the Alt-A?
I'm not sure. A lot of the PS readline features were borrowed. The ideas were borrowed from Fish, the Fish shell, and other shells like that. So it could have been.
Gotcha. I might be wrong. I just feel like Alt, or for some reason that's in my head. But not to put anyone on the spot, does anyone else other than Alt-A have any interesting PS readline key handlers that they enjoy? Oh, Mike Robbins just shared his profile. I'll have a link to that.
So one thing I set the predictor source to history and plugin, but also the F2 to switch from the list view to the tab view. It's not in there by default on Linux, so I defined that one. And then I've got a few others that in my profile that I defined.
The one that I like is remapping the enter key to where is it?
Validate and accept input.
Yes, validate and accept input. By default, it's mapped to accept input. But what validate and accept input does is it validates what you've typed, and if there's an error, it'll tell you the error before it actually tries to run it. So you don't get a runtime error. You have a chance to edit the command and fix it before you hit enter again.
So it'll validate before it goes. That's pretty cool.
Right. And it also means that a typo that you made doesn't end up in your history. So it keeps your history cleaner.
Wow. Oh, hold on while I add that to my.
I like that a lot because more and more I end up on the webcast showcasing PowerShell, and I got a lot of bad commands in there that are starting to pop up for me. So that's actually, this is going to be a game changer for me. I appreciate the tip.
Yeah, there's so much stuff. I use PS Readline somewhat heavily. I'm not like a super advanced user, but I have some customized key cords and stuff like that. But I feel like I need to just dedicate some time and really go through and like learn what's already there and actually like digest what the words say that it does, maybe use it a couple times. Jordan, this sounds like kind of an interesting thing if we were to do like a class or like a little interactive lunch and learn on this, because there's a lot here.
It'd be a great little webcast for you.
Yeah, we did a lunch and learn a week ago, or a couple weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, that one of the main takeaways from this was very beginner was they noticed the PS Readline within the Windows terminal when Andrew was showcasing. So they weren't sure what it was. They just saw a lot of added value that they didn't see on their side. So we got a quick discussion there.
Yeah, quick win. All we have to do is tell people who've never seen it before, install module PS Readline, and boom, we're heroes now.
One other thing that I'll plug while we're here talking about your profile, I created a module called PSStyle. So PSStyle is the new feature in PowerShell 7.2 and above that does all of the ANSI color decorations and all that. But it doesn't exist on earlier versions of PowerShell. And so if you're using PSStyle in your, for example, in your profile script to set color definitions and things like that, like for your prompt or whatever, that won't work on Windows PowerShell 5.1. Well, I created this module called PSStyle. It's in the gallery that gives you the PSStyle variable, and that's configured the same way as it is by default in PowerShell 7.2.
Okay, just because I'm slightly confused, or I was for a minute. PSStyle refers to the variable that's in PowerShell 7,
Yes.
$sign PSStyle, and you made a module that makes that same variable available in previous versions where it doesn't exist.
Right. So you can load that in your, you can code your profile to check to see if you're running on PowerShell 5.1, load the PSStyle module, and then all of your PSStyle, $PSStyle usage will work.
Nice.
So, you won't have all the same features that PowerShell 7.2 has with the colorized tables and other output, because that's built into the engine. But the color definitions and the way it does ANSI color strings, you can use that syntax in your script. So you can have one profile script that works across to all versions.
That's very cool. Was that a challenging module to write?
No, not really. The hardest part was just like I created it as a class, and just defining all the members of the class, copying all the information from the existing $PSStyle variable.
Nice.
And so it loads the class and instantiates an instance of $PSStyle.
Nice.
There's actually no commandlets. It's all it does is load the class.
That works. I see that. Yeah, PSStyle new. I'm looking at the code. That's cool. So yeah, I guess if you're really ready to take your customization to the next level, you can check out the PSStyle variable and start tweaking some colors to maybe further customize them to your liking. I'm curious how customized you all have gone with your PS styles.
Not a whole lot, but this becomes more important if you're using like light-colored themes in your terminals. Out there in the optimizing shell experience, we have another article about configuring a light-colored theme, and because the default color choices, the contrast doesn't always work if you're using a light background, like a white background instead of a dark background.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm a dark background.
One reason you might want to use a light background is if you're doing a presentation, because a lot of times it's difficult to see the dark backgrounds.
That's true. That's the only time I ever do light. Otherwise, it feels like, or if I'm doing like some kind of broadcasty type thing, because it kind of helps to have like a white light, have your screen turn into a white light for you. I have a question.
Yes.
So I see there's a new PDF feature. What is this all about?
Yeah. So this, I meant to mention this in the recent community call, but forgot about it. But this is a new platform feature. We've had the download PDF feature on our docs pages for quite a long time, but it never worked for reference content sets. So we didn't have that available in the PowerShell docs. Well, they have fixed that now. And so you can click on the download PDF button, and depending what page you're viewing at the time, it'll download different things. So if you're looking at our table of contents, you'll notice there's a dividing line between the items, the first set of items, and then at the bottom, the reference item in the table of contents. So everything above reference, above that dividing line, is what we call conceptual documentation. And everything below the line is the reference documentation. So if you're viewing a conceptual article, when you click download PDF, it will download a PDF that is all of the conceptual documentation. And that file, I downloaded one here recently. It's like 85 megabytes.
3,388 pages?
Yeah.
Casual reading.
And then if you are selected, say, on the commandlet reference, then it downloads all of the commandlet reference, all the reference content for the selected version. So if you're on PowerShell 7.3, you'll get the 7.3 content. If you're on PowerShell 5.1, you'll get the 5.1 content, and so on.
Okay, that makes sense. So in the top left, there's a little version drop down. You select what version you're on, and then it'll download the relevant PDF for that.
Yeah, and this is a feature that people have been asking for years now, and I'm sort of two minds. I think it's a cool feature, but I also think that a static PDF can go stale on you, and it wasn't our intent. Our intent is the website has the latest, greatest documentation, and that's where you should be going. But I understand people want something that's a little more portable, they can take with them offline scenarios.
Maybe mark it up or something like that too.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Go ahead.
as far as the content going stale, with PowerShell, you may say, well, there's only so many versions. But if you look at Azure PowerShell, we release every month. So we have a minor version every single month, 10 times a year, and then twice a year we have breaking change versions, so they're major revisions. So it can go stale in a month is my point.
Yeah, I definitely want to check things out online. And in fact, shout out to Get Help Online. Shout out to that parameter. Putting in work as always. I do want to let you know that I kind of forgot. I figured, docs, keep them up to date. I totally forgot that you have to keep multiple different versions, right? Or support docs for different versions of PowerShell. Right. It's like an added layer of complexity that I wasn't thinking of, but apparently you all were.
Yeah. In addition to the multiple versions, so Azure PowerShell works a little bit differently. So our reference documentation originates in our source repo. So it's auto-generated. But then that is, when we release a version, that's more or less like copied to the docs repo. So if I want to update the current a problem, let's say in the current version, I have to go update the version in the docs repo. But then if I want to prevent the problem from occurring in future versions, I have to go update the version in the source repo. And then if I want to update every version, there's 3 to 4 versions in the docs repo and the source version. So you have numerous versions.
Numerous versions in different repos. So yeah,
Yes.
it's a little more complicated.
So would it be possible to have like a script or module that just go and it would say you want to update a certain thing in GitHub, it goes and finds for you there are this many versions and you can just kind of start pushing that out, I guess, more dynamically, or is it always just going to be a one-to-one process?
You can't always just copy the doc because maybe other things have changed in the doc between the versions. Maybe a parameter was added, so you can't just copy the new one to the old one. But we use a tool beyond compare. And I think there's also an open source tool called Meld that you could use that compares the changes, and you can easily merge the changes from one file to the other.
Well,
That's
and
fantastic.
yeah, and Visual Studio Code has a diff mode like that now too. So you can bring up 2 versions from 2 different folders of the same article side by side in comparison mode and copy changes from one file to the other. Selectively copy what you want from one to the other with just a single click.
And so there are some ways, but this does feel like an automation nightmare.
Yeah, it's a very manual process. What I do have is I have a helper script that I run where I can, I call it BC Sync for Beyond Compare Synchronize, and I give it the path to one article. And the script goes out and finds that article in all the other different version folders, and it brings them up one at a time, side by side. And so I copy the necessary changes from one to the other. I exit, and then it opens up again with the next version compared side by side. And it just repeats that until I've covered all of the versions. So it makes it a little bit easier, but it's still a manual process. You have to, it takes a human to understand the context of what needs to be copied from one version to another.
Yeah, in addition to the docs, I mean, just think of the product. It's almost like a paradox because you have all this cross-platform versions, but then now you're getting into like AMD 64 and ARM 64 versions. Because recently personally, I've been using a Mac for a couple of years, but I bought a new MacBook and I pulled down our Docker container, and of course it's got Apple Silicon. So it pulled down the x64 version and it appeared to work until I ran a command, and then it just kind of blew up. And I grabbed the latest Docker image. Well, a couple of versions ago, I believe with 9.6.0 of Azure PowerShell, we've started publishing ARM64 versions of our Docker container. So I needed to grab that version, and it allowed me to determine without anybody reporting it that, hey, our docs were wrong. So yesterday I updated the docs, and now it has a tab for AMD 64 and ARM 64 to make sure you get the right Docker container.
So I'm going to go on a limb and say attention to detail is something you guys check for really thoroughly when hiring.
Yep.
Gosh. So, Mike, how's the blog been, man? How's the personal blog? We're taking a break from the professional. How's the PowerShell blog been, man? Mike F.
So I need to get back to the blog. I've actually had several people reach out to me, even at the summit. It's like, hey, we've read your stuff, we love it. So that kind of gives me, it gives me motivation to get out there and work on the blog. And some of the different things with Macs and Linux that I'm working with is stuff I want to blog, because one thing, it's like I thought to myself, hey, I'm really going to miss Windows Terminal on the Mac. But then I figured out with Parallels, you can actually run Windows Terminal, and you can run it like in the foreground without having a VM. Like it's booted up, but the VM's in the background. So you can run it, and it looks like you're running Windows Terminal on the Mac, even though it kind of reminds me, if you remember years ago when Windows 7 released, there was an XP mode. And XP was technically running on a VM in the background, even though you could have foreground apps.
Wow. So I'm about to get on that Mac bandwagon here in the next couple weeks, hopefully, with my work computer. And it sounds like, so you're using Parallels to run Terminal. Did you like Terminal more, or what was the problem with the other terminals?
I do like the Terminal. Now I'm also using iTerm too, because one thing, the original reason 2 years ago that I bought a Mac Mini, and I just bought the cheapest version, but I bought it to test my documentation, or at least that was my excuse to get into the ecosystem. Because if we're telling our customers that, hey, this documentation or this product is cross-platform, and we're writing docs for it, we need to make sure that it actually does work. Because if you write, say, Mac documentation, and you tell a customer press the enter key, well, the customer who uses a Mac is going to know that that wasn't written by a Mac user, because Mac keyboards don't have an enter key. They have a return key. So just little detail, like you said before, attention to detail. So you can also run like Ubuntu and Fedora, and those are ARM versions within Parallels. And Parallels just makes it like super easy to run. To me, it's not about Windows, Mac, or Linux. What I was really looking for, I want a universal computer. I don't want to have all these different pieces of hardware. I want one computer that I can run Mac OS, Linux, Windows. I can do everything on. And even in addition to all that, you don't want to blow away your bare metal OS every time you want to test something. So the Mac hardware is the only place you can run Mac OS, but Parallels also allows you to run a virtual Mac OS. So that way, if you want to run through documentation on a plain vanilla machine that's Mac, you can spin one up instead of having to reset your bare metal one. So that's the sort of things you're going to see on my blog, in the future, just to kind of answer your question. And I haven't blogged recently, but there are about 300 blog articles. And of course, I've written some books too. And one thing, just to kind of circle back, when I started writing documentation for Azure PowerShell, one thing I learned is that customers didn't really know how to use PowerShell. And I like to use the analogy, they wanted to build a house without learning how to use a hammer. So it's like, hey, I need to empower them to use PowerShell so that they can configure their resources in Azure. So I decided to donate my PowerShell 101 book to Microsoft because it was already written in Markdown. And Sean actually went through and did some edits on that, integrated it into the PowerShell documentation. And at the point in time, I also made the book freely available on LeanPub. And one thing I'll say is watch that space. So that book has over 26,000 readers, not counting the views on the Microsoft website. And I'm rewriting that book for PowerShell 7. And I'm going to publish it. I'm not publishing a new book because it's still going to be open source. I'm going to update the existing book. So everybody who has the book already will get the new book.
Nice. Very cool. I'll have to make sure I'm recommending that link whenever people are looking for PowerShell 101 content.
Yeah, that's in the main PowerShell doc set in the table of contents under Learning PowerShell. That's the first entry there is Mike's book. And we really appreciate his donation here. We're also trying to create Learn modules or training modules that's part of the Microsoft Learn platform. But the process of creating those is much more difficult and much more constrained, and we just haven't had the time to focus on it. So there's not a lot of there's a lot of Azure PowerShell training modules, but not a lot of just core PowerShell training modules on Learn. So the PowerShell 101 is really probably the best place to start.
Slight pivot here, but I want to mention something that I just discovered about PowerShell recently, security-wise, and we don't have to get into too much detail with it. But in PowerShell 7.2, so this is a little older news, but there's now a software bill of materials.
Yes.
Did you all know that? I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's actually by executive order from the President of the United States. Software that is sold to or used by the government has to have this software bill of materials. And so all of our, everything that the PowerShell team publishes has to include that. And so it's sort of a manifest that has digital signatures for all of the components that we ship.
Yeah, very cool. And that's at $PS home /_manifest. And then there's some other stuff after that. I won't read the whole path, but another good Microsoft Learn article. I probably need to go through these and make sure I'm familiar with all the good articles that are there. Because I think there's go ahead.
Also, circling back to what Sean was saying about the training modules. So I've recently worked with our broader team, because we work on the same team as the writers for Terraform and Bicep and Azure CLI. But I worked on that broader team to come up with a training module that helps our customers choose the best Azure command line tool for managing their cloud infrastructure. So it talks about infrastructure as code, it talks about imperative, declarative, and it shows the same example of creating a storage account, and it shows you how to do that in each tool, so you can see the differences in the syntax, and it helps you make choices. Maybe you're multi-cloud. Well, if you're multi-cloud and you're choosing between Bicep and Terraform, of course you're going to use Terraform because you can only use Bicep in Azure. So it helps customers just getting started figure out what tools would be the best fit for them.
So just a random thought here. It's a complex world out there. There's a lot of Microsoft products. They do a lot of different things. And oftentimes, thinking back to when I was an admin, I would not always know the right direction, the right approach. How do they want us to use this new technology? There's so many options. And advice and kind of a conclusion that I always keep coming back to is it really helps to go read the documentation, right? What documentation, from my perspective, allows is you can kind of show us the direction we should go. You can show us how we should use these features. And we're talking about PowerShell and Azure, but you can show us how we could approach this rather than just looking at all the technical details of a particular technology and being like, oh, how do I put all this together? Well, check out the Microsoft Docs. Now, learn.microsoft.com. A little plug there.
Yeah, and I also wanted to point out some other recent changes in the docs. Actually, if you go to at the top of our table of contents, we have this article, how to use this documentation. And I recently updated this, and it the first animated screenshot there shows you the different components of our docs page. And so when you're looking at our docs page, you know, the top bar there is the Microsoft Learn bar. That gets you to links you to all kinds of other areas in the Microsoft Learn site. Below that is the PowerShell navigation bar, and that links to other related PowerShell content. And one that I wanted to point out is we recently moved the PowerShell Gallery and PowerShell Get documentation out into its own doc set, and that's linked to there on the level 2 navigation bar. And you'll see there now we have a version picker for PowerShell Get. So you can switch between version 1, which is the version that ships in Windows PowerShell 5.1, version 2, which is the current supported version, and then version 3, which is the new preview version. And we'll be updating that documentation for PowerShell 3 as new releases come out and we get closer to GA. But if you're looking for that documentation, you won't find it in the main doc set. We had to split it out so that we could better manage it by version.
We'll make sure we get a link to that, especially where I'm watching the cycle through all the different sections now. It's pretty useful. There's more components in there you might expect, so we'll get a link so people can go and they can see and dive in easier.
And I think this is an underutilized feature in the level 2 navigation there is the module browser. And in the module browser, you can go in and this helps you find commandlets and modules that we have published and documented, and you can search by nouns. So if you know you're looking for a commandlet that works with certificates, you could just start typing in certificate, and you'll get a whole list. And instead of trying to know what module it's in and where to find that documentation.
Nice. Now, Jordan, have you thought about how we want to handle this? I was thinking just 2 favorite modules each. We've already put them through the ringer once.
We have. The other option is we have 3 questions and 3 guests, and they could fight over who gets the easy one.
There's no easy one. Excuse me.
Well, before we do that, I give a quick PSA of a hard lesson learned by me. Actually, maybe I'll take question 1 of a mistake you've made, and how did you handle it? What did you learn? I built a script I was trying to clean up Apex packages, and I had a allow list of what I wanted to keep, and I didn't realize that Windows Terminal is actually an Apex package. And I tested it on my personal machine, and I deleted Terminal from my own machine. And so what I learned is use my lab when I'm testing my scripts, I guess.
There you go.
That is a good one to learn.
So one last thing I would like to plug. So on July 29th, there's a SQL Saturday in Baton Rouge, and there's going to be a PowerShell track, and I'll be there. I think Sean may be there. But we started this out talking about birthdays, and so me and Sean actually share the same birthday, and you can come help us celebrate our birthdays at SQL Saturday in Baton Rouge. And I won't tell you exactly what day our birthdays are on because I'm not sure that Sean wants to disclose that, but it's around the same time as SQL Saturday in Baton Rouge. The other thing is there's going to be a PowerShell on the River the second weekend in August, and it's I believe a Friday Saturday event. Fridays are pre-cons. Me and Sean hope to be presenting sessions there if they're approved. So during this podcast, we talked about Markdown and Git and GitHub and Docs, and we hope to be presenting sessions that are going to be a little more deep dive into some of those topics.
Very cool. I hope to see you there. I'm working on wheeling and dealing my way to get there.
We do that a lot for a lot of these summits, and Jen are always pushing. So we'll include a link to the SQL Saturday. So anyone that's interested in that, they can go and sign up or see if they want to go for that one. And then as well as the PowerShell on the River, I know that's one that I think you said 2 days, so it's a little bit shorter event, but there's a lot of value packed into it from, I understand you've never been able to go.
And PowerShell on the River, I mean, there is a cost for it, but it's fairly low budget. SQL Saturday in Baton Rouge is a free event, and they also provide lunch, and they provide jambalaya every year. I go every year just for the jambalaya.
Well, Jordan, let me get the second question because I have a custom tailored question for Mikey.
Okay.
Mikey, what is an open source project that you recently stumbled across that could use a boost in documentation that you so took it upon yourself to totally revamp and improve?
Yeah. It's funny that you ask that. We've been starting to use a bunch of different open source tools in our workflows, right? Just stuff to make things easier on us. For those who aren't familiar with the GitHub command line, that's great, and you should use that. They actually have a docs team, so they have pretty extensive docs. What doesn't usually have extensive documentation, though, if it has any at all, are extensions for the GitHub command line. So you can author these little extensions, and then you run gh extension install, and then whatever the URL is for where that is on GitHub, and it adds it. And then you can use that extension as a subcommand. So one that Sean and I use extensively is the GitHub dashboard, which when you install it, you type gh dash and hit enter, and it pulls up a dashboard of issues and pull requests. So we both use this to check on repositories and see what issues have come in, what pull requests are there, what needs my attention, what am I just tracking because I'm curious about it, those kinds of things. And we have coworkers who have a really big backlog of issues, and they struggle to kind of get their heads around which of these are actually important, what's assigned to me, how do I use it? And they're not primarily open source developers. They're documentarians who happen to be working in an open source way. And so sending them to the docs for building GitHub search syntax and being like, yeah, and here's all the other stuff you can do, that starts to get harder and harder. And then you have to remember all of those, or like I do every time, look it up. And that's really tough. So I was like, I want to tell coworkers about GH dash. But then I remembered that they're not developers, and saying, well, read the README and then check the code to see how it's implemented so you're sure about what it's going to do. Not a good answer. Pretty terrible answer for any open source software. So I filed an issue with the maintainer. I was like, hey, you should have a docs site that explains how to configure this thing and what happens when you're in the UI, because the way that it presents, I should have mentioned this earlier, when you run gh dash, it builds a text user interface in your console, in your terminal, that displays all that information for you. I was like, you should explain what these things are and have documentation for what the commands do beyond when you're in the dashboard. If you hit the question mark key on your keyboard, it pulls up a little list of the available commands, and it just says what the command name is and what the key to activate that command is. So here's the thing that I didn't know till I decided that somebody had to write the docs and no one was stepping up, so I'll do it. It has a feature for being able to merge a PR from the dashboard. That's really cool, right? Like I can say, yeah, I've approved it. I'm going to go ahead and merge it. There's no confirmation prompt. If your cursor, if you have selected a PR in the dashboard and you hit the M key on your keyboard, it'll merge that right now as it is. So you don't want to oopsie with your fingers or you'll start merging PRs.
And this is a text UI where you're like clicking in your console. So it's
your keyboard navigating around in your console.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
And it's an easy mistake to make. And so I filed the issue and I was like, I'm going to take a stab at this. And the maintainer replied to me and was like, well, what would you document? And I had to step away from the computer for a second because like my reflexive answer was the software.
all of it.
The tool, the thing you made. So I had to come back and be like, because the README doesn't really talk about the commands at all. It says that they're there and like mentions that you can do these things, but not how they work or what they're doing behind the scenes or any of that. And then the configuration, to me, it was very clear that as the maintainer was adding features, they were also writing down some notes about how those features worked. And that was the only documentation that shipped. So in a ADHD haze over a weekend, I went through the source code and the existing README and pulled together JSON schema for the entirety of the configuration options. And I have some side projects, one of which takes a schema that you define in YAML or JSON with some extra keys for documentation, generates documentation pages, throws away the keys that were used for building the documentation, and then publishes the JSON schema in a way that your editor can pick up. So after this documentation effort, now that it's merged, you can add a magic comment to the top of your YAML files or indicate the with the $schema key at the top of your JSON files. And you'll get IntelliSense, you'll get hover help, you'll get validation for the configuration options for GH- now. So part of it was just I needed to do this so that I could talk to other people about it. It's like I want to recommend you use it, but I can't recommend you use it in the current state. And then part of it was also a personal experiment for like, can we do schema documentation better? And it seems clear to me that you can. I think I've settled on a way to do that.
So this is it's a weird area because you're not exactly taking work home because you're just doing your full-time job in something else now.
Yeah, which was always true, back when I was in ops and I was primarily writing scripts and when I was a open source developer full-time. A lot of my side project work is I encountered a frustration during the day and I'm going to go and make that frustration disappear over the weekend. And hopefully they take it. And I had some real concerns that the maintainer would be like, this is too much and I don't know what to do with it. I'm not going to accept it. And a friend of mine had mentioned that was like, what if they reject it? And I was like, well, then I'll fork it and I'll call it GH Dasher and I'll give it a reindeer as an icon. And it'll be the exact same code, but with docs. It'll just be a documented fork. I won't change any of the functionality.
Nice. Well, we'll have a link to GH Dash in the show notes as well, and you can check out the documentation, learn a thing or two.
And if you find problems in the docs, let me know. I'll fix them.
So for our listeners, we always have a couple of documents links that we include, 3 or 4. But we've been talking to 3 people that documentation is their business. So there's a lot of great documentation we've got for this time that you might want to cycle through. If you're interested on any point where they talked about, we have the documentation for it ready to go. So
Hickory Dickory docs, we got them all.
I think, are we going to count that as the common parameters?
I think so. We covered a lot.
Well, you guys are all return guests, so you are aware of what time it is, and it's a magical time in everyone's life. Honestly, having 3 legends here to celebrate my birthday with me has been great, but no honor is greater than having Andrew live shill this podcast, and I get to be front row. Take it away, Andrew.
Thank you. You know what, Jordan? This morning I woke up, I said, let's do something different today. Let's just sing awkwardly the entire happy birthday song for everyone to hear. Now, I decided against it. We should all awkwardly, out of sync, sing. No. Thank you, Jordan. Happy birthday to you, man. What a celebration. We covered some great stuff. I learned new things. I was reading along to docs as we were talking about the different docs and kept on discovering new things this whole episode. So definitely check out our show notes. There's some amazing stuff. And listen, if you're still listening, I'm still talking. I'm still shilling. We're still here. Like, comment, subscribe. Give us a 5-star review. If you're on Apple Podcasts, write something. We love reading comments. If you're on the YouTube comments, say what's up. You can email us. You got questions you want to reach out, PowerShell@pdq.com. I'm on the internet at Andrew Platek. He's at DevOps Jordan. Jordan, am I missing some other plug that I need to do?
You give the email, right?
PowerShell@pdq.com. Yeah, we're good there, man.
I'll be honest, I wasn't listening to you.
Hey, you were just wowed. I feel that. Now, we'll start from order to top right and go around, but where can we find you all on the internet? Sean.
Oh, gosh. I'm SD Wheeler at GitHub and Fostodon. Those are probably the 2 best places to start.
Perfect. Mikey, what's the GitHub for you?
The GitHub for me is Michael T. Lombardi. It's where all of my side projects sit. Well,
2,412 contributions this year. Quite a few.
Yeah, a few. A lot of my numbers for this last month are inhuman because GitHub attributed all of the PRs I merged from the Docathon and all of the commits in those PRs to me, which is not how numbers should work.
Well, congrats on your excellent month.
It's like, you did 260 commits this week. No, I didn't.
The corporate America, you take all the victory. for everyone else's work.
Be on top.
Awesome. Well, Mike, where can we find you?
You can always find me on mikeuprovins.com. That's probably the best place to find everything. It's got links to Twitter. I need to add my Fastodon account, but it's Mike F. Robbins. I mean, just I try to sign up for everything with that handle because I'm a big believer in personal branding. So pretty much anywhere you can find me at Mike F. Robbins.
So I have noticed you have that everywhere. So if a new service comes up and you're not even sure if you're going to be using that, do you still go in and just register to get Mike F. Robbins early? Or is it something you just hope that's well played.
I have accounts that I've signed up for I've never used, but I own the account.
That's the way to go about it.
Nice. Well, Jordan, fantastic birthday, fantastic celebration with some fantastic guests, with some fantastic docs for another amazing episode of the PowerShell podcast.
Thanks so much for talking to us, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for listening to the PowerShell podcast with your hosts, Jordan Hammond and Andrew Plough.
2 kinds of flavor, 2 kinds of crunch.
The PowerShell podcast is a production of PDQ.com, making device management simple, secure, and pretty damn quick.